Heute im Rasenfunk.
I realised that I was really behaving in ways that I soon learnt were also really detrimental to other women just because I wanted to be accepted. And that's when I really started to change my fan self, because I felt empowered in the women's sports space that I can wear whatever I want here and I can go to any sport here. I don't need to know 100% all of the facts, all of the players' names. No one's going to make fun of me for doing that. I can just sit here and enjoy the space. I can go for multiple teams at the same time because I like different players. Women need to work up to where their male counterparts are. And I just feel like this is an opportunity to almost do the opposite, that let's look at some different measures of what success means, because I think this emerging fan culture is showing us a different way to promote, celebrate and enjoy sport that the men's codes can learn from.
Das Tribünengespräch.
Hello, welcome to Rasenfunk, the international edition. If you are an English-speaking listener, stick with me. There will follow some German words, but this is an international episode. It's mostly in English. You can skip the next part if you want. Just go to the next chapter mark or stay with me and learn some beautiful German language, because I have to greet also my German-speaking audience now. Und das mache ich genau jetzt. Hallo und herzlich willkommen zum Rasenfunk. Na, das war mal ein überraschender Einstieg. Auch für mich. Immer mal wieder was Neues machen. Warum habe ich gerade auf Englisch gesprochen? Nun ja, weil diese Folge hier, wir haben sie ja auch schon angekündigt, hauptsächlich auf Englisch stattgefunden hat. Annika hat für uns ein richtig tolles Interview geführt mit Dr. Kasey Symons. Wenn ihr Name euch noch kein Begriff ist, dann werdet ihr nach diesem Tribünengespräch schlauer sein. Annika hat vor Ort in Australien ein Interview mit ihr geführt. Dieses Interview ist auf Englisch, aber wie wir euch versprochen haben, haben wir auch für eine Möglichkeit gesorgt für alle diejenigen, die des Englischen nicht mächtig sind oder nicht so gut mächtig sind oder vielleicht auch einfach begleitend auf Deutsch mitlesen wollen. Wenn ihr in die Shownotes geht, dann findet ihr dort ein PDF mit einer erst automatisch erstellten und dann nochmal von uns überprüften Übersetzung dieses Gesprächs. Ich habe dort auch die einzelnen Kapitelmarken als Zwischenüberschriften eingefügt. Das heißt, solltet ihr sagen, Mensch, ich verstehe das leider nicht, aber mich interessiert das Thema, dann bekommt ihr diese Folge zum Lesen und ich hoffe, das ist dann für euch auch akzeptabel. In diesem Sinne, schön, dass ihr eingeschaltet habt. Herzlichen Dank an alle, die uns unterstützen. Auch ihr habt diese Folge möglich gemacht. Darunter sind unter anderem Bene, Meta, Baron, Uli the Hero, na das passt ja, Wilmes, CL3 und Magdeburger. Magdeburger, würde ich sagen. So ist es richtig. So, herzlichen Dank für eure Unterstützung. Der Rasenfunk ist und bleibt Werbe-, Paywall- und sponsorenfrei. Wir sind rein crowdgefundet. Herzlichen Dank an alle, die uns unterstützen. Auf rasenfunk.de/supportersclub findet ihr alle Informationen. Und ich will jetzt gar nicht zu viel Vorrede machen. Es folgt jetzt wirklich ein interessantes Gespräch. Ich denke, ihr habt an den O-Tönen im Intro schon gemerkt. Es wird hier mal ganz anders über Frauensport gesprochen und über Weiblichkeit im Fan-Dasein. Ich wünsche euch viel Spaß mit dem Interview. Ab jetzt übernimmt Annika. Annika wird das Ganze auf Englisch führen. Annika schmeißt uns auch aus der Sendung raus. Und dann freuen sowohl Annika als auch ich mich sehr auf euer Feedback unter mitmachen.rasenfunk.de oder in den sozialen Netzwerken. Ich würde sagen, das reicht. Ich wünsche euch viel Spaß mit dem Interview. Let's go!
So today I have the pleasure to talk to Dr. Kasey Symons, and you are a lot of things. You are a postdoctoral research fellow at Swinburne University here in Melbourne, and you research fans and fandom, and especially female fans and gender bias, which we will get into in a bit. Then you are also a co-founding member of Siren Sports, which is a women in sports media collective. And through this, or connected to this, you also publish about women's sport. And then you have also been working in the past at Australian Football League clubs. Then, of course, you're also a sports fan yourself. And last but definitely not least, you are very busy and a very welcoming person here in Australia during the World Cup. So hi and welcome to Rasenfunk.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Annika. Annika, and for that wonderful and lovely introduction. And you just reminded me why I'm so tired. But they're all, amazing things I have the opportunity to do. I'm very blessed here in, I guess, for us who are in Melbourne, we call Melbourne the sporting capital of the world.
Oh, wow.
Because we have so many sports available to us and a very sport-focused community. So there's lots of opportunities. And like you said, my biggest passion is really pushing forward women's sport and working in gender equality in sport across a lot of different levels. So not only participation on the field, but the fan culture and the bigger picture around women's sport and how that can change our society for the better. So I feel like living in Melbourne's given me a lot of opportunities. I love research. I love working with sporting organisations. I love working with journalists and storytellers. So as much as I do feel like I get to do a lot of things that I love. So that helps with the exhaustion.
Yeah, I can relate to that a little bit.
Definitely right. We all do it for the passion. And I think being a fan, like you said, when I introduce myself to people, I find it really hard to distill my job title into something that's easy to say. So a lot of the time I do say that I'm a sports fan first. And that's the biggest reason that I'm in this space is because I love sport so much. And I know there are parts of sport that aren't perfect and I can maybe play a role in trying to drive some change there, but it all comes from being a fan. So when you're a fan of something and you love it and you're passionate, that makes the work a lot easier too.
Yeah, definitely. So I think what might be fun for people who are listening to this to know is that we didn't meet the first time here in Australia at the World Cup, but in Germany because you were traveling Europe and through Früf, which people who are listening to this will know, we met at a Bundesliga match between my women's side club, which is SGS Essen versus Turbine Potsdam, and you bought a very fabulous scarf. Do you still have it?
I did, yes. It's actually in my office at Swinburne University, so I have it above my desk. So when people come in, they see the purple and the white and they're like, oh, what team is that? And I get to tell them the story of how we met, which I think is so special. Part of my research, I had the opportunity to go to Germany last year to work with a team there about fandom of women's football in Germany as well as Australia as a bit of a comparative study. So as part of that, I think put out on Twitter that I was going to travel to Germany. I put the towns that I was visiting and I had connected a little bit with the Früf team and Mara on social media before I went because they've been such amazing supporters of Siren. When we launched the Siren women's sport platform in 2020, I think Früf was one of the first other women's sport media outlets to follow us. And I remember seeing it pop up and we're like, there's this amazing team in Germany who are following us. This is so weird. How did they find us? And then it just made us think that this is exactly why looking at fandom of women's sport is so interesting and has so many possibilities because so many fans around the world have created these amazing platforms and social media connects us in a way that hasn't before and we've made so many friends online. So when I got to Germany, I got to meet Mara and some of the amazing other women and non-binary people as part of that team in Mainz and went out and had an amazing night talking and I think I said something to Mara like, I really want to see a Bundesliga match, but my travel schedule doesn't allow too much. And she looked up the fixture for me and she's like, oh, you're going to be in Cologne when Essen's playing. That's really close. I know Annika, she will be there. Just go to the game and you will meet and it'll be amazing. And I was like, oh, okay, this is incredible. And I had a friend out of Cologne who took me out there and it was such a great game day experience and meeting you in person was just incredible. And I just loved that moment so much. And you told me so much about the history of Essen and the two teams that were playing. So it was Potsdam as well.
Yeah.
And they're both standalone women's teams, which I thought was so special to see how clubs like that are trying to survive in that environment without having a men's counterpart as well. So I really appreciate you explaining that history to me and giving me all that information. But that moment, Annika, for me just was so powerful. Like I said, just demonstrates this connectivity we have in the women's sport community that technology and social media and new media has empowered so many of us to do our own thing, to put our voices out there, and that we support each other no matter what language we speak. Unfortunately, and I'm sorry to your listeners that I don't speak German. I wish I did. But that you were all able to communicate with me, and we can see what each other is doing on these platforms we've all created around the world and in other sporting codes as well. I know you're mostly focused on women's football, and that's a space I'm pretty new to, and there's a lot of other collectives out there that are focused on different sporting codes, but at the end of the day I think we all just support each other for driving the conversation forward around women's sport. And then when we do get to meet at amazing events like the Women's World Cup, like these last few weeks, seeing yourself again and seeing other women that I've known on social media in real life, it's like it's surreal. It's like a homecoming and a family reunion of people you actually want to see, which is just amazing. It just speaks to the power of our community and just how much is changing because we are so connected now. And I think that's the really cool thing about what's happening in women's sport at the moment.
Yes, it's really nice. And especially what you just said about it being like a family meeting, being here and actually seeing the people you just read on Twitter or somewhere else. It's just been really nice the last couple of weeks I've been here. So I was wondering, because it's something I'm thinking about a lot, being a fan first, but then kind of bumbling my way into being a freelance sports journalist. How did these different positions you've held in the past and now being in academia affect your view on, sports and fandom, and how did it change your being a fan, maybe?
That's a great question. And first of all, I would say you're not bumbling through. You're doing very well. You're a very talented journalist. But this is something, I guess, that was really shaped by my research and when I started doing my honours and my PhD, because at the time I was working at the AFL, so the Australian Football League, in a sort of a corporate communications role. And I didn't grow up in Melbourne. I'm from a small country town about 6 hours drive away. So growing up, I was just sport obsessed, not playing sport. I need to be very clear about that. I'm a pretty lazy person. I hate running.
Same.
It's just not for me. I tried a few sports here and there and did something socially, but the biggest connection I ever had to sport was being a fan. I love watching it on TV. I love going to our local Aussie rules football matches in my community and seeing my friends and family play and just being part of the atmosphere. I just loved it so much. So moving to the big city for university, I did an arts degree. I really wanted to be a writer, was trying to get into sport in some way, and I managed to get a position at the Australian Football League. And for like a young woman coming to the city loving football, when I say football, I mean Aussie rules here, because that was my favourite sport, it was like a dream come true. Like I couldn't imagine that that's what I would do. So it was surreal. It was like this amazing shiny thing that I had, having this position. I got to experience so many different events and meet so many amazing people and just really be part of the inner workings of this thing I love so much. But in doing that, there was still something that was missing from what I was enjoying in my role, and I wasn't really sure what that was, but opportunities kept coming up for me to continue my study. So I got invited to complete my honours degree because I was sort of in this threshold of what I achieved in my undergraduate, and I thought, I'll give that a go. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I wanted to keep doing some more study around using writing and storytelling to, I guess, deep dive a little bit more into the culture of sport in Australia. And while I was doing that, I was sort of looking at some more, I guess, gender studies, and that was something I hadn't really engaged with in my undergraduate degree. I was more focused on just creative writing and looking at different types of literature and sports writing. And by starting that process, I started to, almost pull back the curtain a little bit on some of these elements of gender that were playing a role in the space that I was working in, how I felt when I was sitting in the stadium watching men's Australian rules football, and how I felt in the workplace. And I sort of kept going through that process of studying and reflecting on different feminist literature and looking at how different women sort of explored their experiences in different sports. And what I started to realize was, because I was so in love with this sport and my team, and I was working in this environment that I just thought was perfect, I realized that I was really behaving in ways that I soon learnt were also really detrimental to other women, just because I wanted to be accepted. And I wrote a lot about this in my thesis, was this way that some women can become compliant in these systems of power, compliant within patriarchal structures, because it's almost like a blueprint for acceptance. And there were some things that I was doing as a fan, like, you know, moments that I would think, I would look at other women and how they were dressed in the stadium, what they were wearing. If they didn't know enough about the stats and facts, I would roll my eyes. And that's behavior that I'm really ashamed that, you know, I was part of, because that's all that I saw around me, was that's how you have to be a fan. And if you don't want to be made fun of, or you don't want to have your, like, a finger pointed at you that you don't belong here, you have to behave in these ways. So I did that. And what I realized, because I've come from a background of creative writing and literature, is that we're so framed by the stories we consume and what we see in media. And I hadn't seen any literature really on these complicated experiences that women and non-binary people have of being fans of elite men's sport. And when you do see diverse fans represented, they're really, you know, stereotyped in different ways. So to be a real fan, you have to perform these behaviors that have been presented for such a long time, which are really reflective of, you know, this sometimes toxic masculinity, this male hegemony, and it's just didn't make me feel good after I started looking at this more and more. And I realized that, actually, you know, I love my sport and I love my team, and I'm never going to walk away from them because I have this passion as a fan. But there are these parts of it that it's taken me a really long time to realize that I don't love. And sometimes I don't always feel amazing at the stadium. And I started noticing how I behaved and how I looked at other women. And I really wanted to change that. So my PhD thesis was all about looking at this lack of representation of diverse fans in Australian rules football, but then starting to look more broadly. And then that led me to look at women's sport and how the fan culture is so different around women's sport. And that's when I really started to change my fan self, or my fandom, because I felt empowered in the women's sport space that, I can wear whatever I want here, and I can go to any sport here. I don't need to know 100% all of the facts, all of the players' names. No one's going to make fun of me for doing that. I can just sit here and enjoy the space. I can go for multiple teams at the same time because I like different players. And that's not a fan culture that's, you know, represented in men's football or men's sport. And I think going through that process and keeping my central fan identity sort of part of that process, I was able to acknowledge where I wasn't the best fan and wasn't the best feminist, and not ignore that or try to forget that, but bring that story with me to keep talking about it, even though there's some things like I said, I'm quite ashamed of and feel not great about. I think it's important to keep that conversation going because I know I'm not alone in that experience, and also trying to keep comparing that to the experience that I have now following a lot of women's sport and the inviting and welcoming culture that's there. So I think my fan identity, to go back to your question after my very long explanation, has changed quite a lot. And I've been able to find parts of it that are really special to me that I love. And then I've been able to feel a bit more confident in things about the fan identity that I don't love. And now I sort of am able to make a stand about the things that I want to change and how I want to be as a fan, and sort of carry that confidence with me to hopefully send that message out to others that there's not just one way to be a fan, and you can be the fan you want to be, and it's okay. Yeah, it's very interesting because I don't know if it's the same here, but in Germany, I feel like there's a lot of conversation right now around women's football and fandom and how to be a right fan or a correct fan in quotation marks. But
the blueprint is always what we know from male football or like men's football, and I don't know. I mean, there's reasons, as you just said, why people are maybe leaving the space or are trying to find new ways for themselves. So I don't know. What would you think could change this culture, or what are ways to create a different, more inclusive, welcoming culture in fandom?
I would say there's very similar trends happening here to what you just mentioned from Germany. And it's something that I'm trying to do some more research on. So having sort of my first sporting love be Australian rules football, I've started doing some research around the AFLW, which is the new women's league that was created in 2017. And that fan culture was really interesting because originally the AFL had slated to create a women's competition in 2020, and they brought it forward a few years because there were some other sports that were a bit ahead of where they were, and they wanted to not miss the moment. So the fan culture at the start was kind of this celebration of, oh, we've got it early, like this is great, we have a few more years ahead of when it was meant to come to celebrate this moment. And it brought a lot of people in. And I think what was assumed was that the fans of the men's teams that existed would just come and support their women's teams, and it would kind of just mirror what was happening in the men's code. But over the last few years, what I've found in my research is there's a lot of fans that come to the AFLW to watch the women play Australian rules football that might have been fans of the men's competition years ago, but kind of left the space. And I spoke to a few fans, and they would say things to me like, I couldn't go to the stadium anymore because every time I went, I would experience homophobia. Every time I went to the stadium, I would hear sexist remarks. I didn't feel comfortable going to the stadium wearing like a hijab or wearing religious coverings because they felt people were looking at them. And then conversely, there were experiences of fans who said that there were athletes on their team that were accused of sexual assault and domestic violence, and they didn't feel like the team or the league had handled that in a way that made them feel good to continue to support their team. So they kind of just left and didn't follow Australian rules football for a long time. And then the start of this women's league allowed them to continue to love the sport, but in a way where all of those things were washed away. It didn't matter anymore. They could go to the stadium wearing whatever they liked, supporting whoever they wanted, supporting, like I was saying before, like multiple teams and multiple players, and they could wear their pride flags and anything else that they wanted to support that had a political message to it, and could do so without the fear of other fans shouting at them or disagreeing with them. It was a much more family-friendly atmosphere. So yes, there's definitely still like alcohol available in the stadiums there, and people are having a drink and having a good time, but it's such a different environment than the alcohol-fueled violence or aggression that you might sometimes experience at men's football. So this is all coming through really strongly in the research that I'm doing now, and I'm just trying to gather more and more of these stories, because I think sometimes when we talk about, the momentum we're experiencing in women's sport, and in this case, I'm talking about Australian rules football, but it goes for many other codes as well, that success is what the men are at now. Like, women need to work up to where their male counterparts are. And I just feel like this is an opportunity to almost do the opposite, that let's look at some different measures of what success means, because I think this emerging fan culture is showing us a different way to promote, celebrate and enjoy sport that the men's codes can learn from, just because it's been this way for so long and it attracts a certain amount of people. We think that's the benchmark for success, but perhaps if we looked to women's sport and what's happening in the fan culture around the games over here, maybe we could attract more people to men's sport. Just because there's this sort of ceiling of a number there doesn't mean that women have to aspire to that. It's almost like there are so many fans that the men's codes are missing, because I would argue that it's not just these fans that are coming to women's sport now that have been affected by that environment. I'm sure there are many people in our society that look at sport and think, that is not for me. I don't feel welcome there and I'm not interested in anything that's happening there. Whereas if we were to change some of that culture, maybe we could bring a lot more people along who are really missing out on the social benefits that sport can provide, but is not completely on offer, I would argue, in most men's sporting environments. So I think women's sport is showing us that there's a lot of opportunities there to learn for all sports, not just women's sports.
Yeah, I would think that, I don't know, I mean, I mostly know German football, so I know that there are quite a few left-leaning, liberal and open fan spaces as well, who would probably argue a bit against that, but I still feel that there's a lot of unwritten rules you kind of have to adhere to be, well, accepted in this space, or like not questioned, at least in this space. So I think it's very interesting. And I also feel like we always have to say that it's not just about women or non-binary people in women's sport, but there's a lot of men supporting those teams. I mean, here at the World Cup, you can see it at every match, which I think is really great, but also in the Frauen-Bundesliga in Germany.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is so, like, that should not be the message that women's sport is just for women and non-binary people. It's for everyone. And women's sport does so much to help dismantle that patriarchy, because I think we need to remember that you're 100% right. The patriarchy also isn't the best for men. Like, it creates an environment where men also have to perform in certain ways to succeed and to demonstrate their masculinity, which is, is quite toxic. So men are not served by the patriarchy, even though they might be served financially or feel safer in society, and they do have that privilege, but it's also a disservice to our men as well. And also, just picking up on what you said there about some clubs in Europe, and which is what I loved about being able to travel for this research project and experience this in Germany, was one club I got to tour was St. Pauli in Hamburg.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right, Annika. Like, when you go into an environment of men's sport that is set up to be, welcoming and accepting, like, it really affected me going to that club. And I remember walking under this archway that just said, "Football has no gender."
Yeah.
And I've never seen anything like that at a stadium for men's sport. And it fundamentally changed how I felt in a second. And I'm sure, there are things that the club probably still is working on, like nothing's perfect, but I felt that they're doing such amazing work. And talking to the tour guide there who took me around and some of the programs they're involved with, seeing rainbow flags painted everywhere, seeing signs in the stadium in German that, no one is illegal. These things just really had a real profound effect on how I felt in the stadium in the moment. And it was the exact opposite of how I felt in some stadiums, where you kind of want to shrink yourself and you don't want anyone to see you. You just want to focus on the game because you're worried about how other people are going to perceive your place there. Being in St. Pauli was like, I wanted to just shout from the rooftops, and I felt so excited to be there. And I went and spent many of my euros at the team store, which I bought back all these things, and I started following St. Pauli results. There's also an Australian connection there, so our Socceroos captain Jackson Irving plays for St. Pauli, so that's really nice. And he's also an amazing athlete who I think is challenging that male hegemony that we see in a lot of men's athletes, and trying to change that narrative of what it means to be a man and play what we'd call a quote unquote man's sport, which I really love to see. So yeah, there's definitely some clubs doing better work than others, and some men who are really being amazing allies to that global movement of sport and culture, and challenging those toxic masculinist tropes. So definitely I'm not going to be that person that says hashtag not all men. No. But it's not all men, and I do appreciate the allies that are out there. So yeah, it's I think there's a lot of really great clubs doing good work that other sports I hope can look to as examples to keep doing that work, because I don't know, I'm just a case study of one person who had that experience.
But actually, I have seen so many people here with St. Pauli kits or scarves or buttons. It's been really the first time I was surprised, but now I'm not surprised anymore, because it's every other day I'm seeing someone and I think, wow, that's pretty amazing. Actually.
Yeah, that's so cool. Like you're so far away from home and you just see like, what is that doing here? But I think, the Jackson Irving connection I think is good. But I think like Australian sporting culture is interesting too. Like we do look to the rest of the world for, examples of elite sport. Like we kind of have a little bit of a little sibling kind of complex. So we look at American sports and European sports as kind of the peak of sports entertainment, and those kind of sports sometimes are treated a little bit like brands here. So you probably see a lot of people wearing like NBA gear and NFL gear and might not identify as fans, but the culture is kind of like, well, it's cool.
Yeah.
So we kind of do that a bit. But when you see, and I've seen a few things like this World Cup, like St. Pauli's interesting. I think there are people who are a little bit more have gone beyond that kind of factor and are identifying with clubs around the world that are doing cool things. Like Lose FC is another example. People here are really responding just to what they're doing in terms of pay equality. And that's like a small club and we're just like, no, that's awesome. We're going to support you. It doesn't matter that we're not physically there. We just want to get behind those things. Same with something like Angel City coming out of the US. So there's definitely, I'm seeing more and more fans following these social movements from sport around the world. And I think that goes to, like we were saying earlier, like social media, being connected, just trying to support each other in this space, I think is a very cool thing.
Yeah. So I was wondering, I know that there's quite a bit of research on fans in general, but mostly it's fans in, men's sports, or like female fans in men's sports spaces. But I was wondering how much research there actually already is on, fans in women's sports.
Not much.
Why am I not surprised?
Yeah, definitely an emerging field. So it is quite a difficult space to get into because there hasn't been much done before. In saying that, there are some, incredible leaders in this field who are starting to do that work. And I think have a similar background to myself that really came into this space being fans of men's sport and sort of looking at the gender relations in the fan experience of, coming from being a woman who's just trying to find her way in men's sport, and then understanding that that's not the only space that's available, and finding these incredible other spaces that, these trailblazing women have been building for such a long period of time. And there's a few of my fellow academics that are now, we're trying to rectify that omission in research and do that work. So we're really building on the foundations that have been set there of amazing research of women, of elite men's sport and that culture, and trying to show, I guess what I was touching on earlier, the counterculture that's in women's sport. So there's been a little bit done on soccer, football. I've started to do a little bit on AFLW, and now I'm doing a little bit more on women's football as well. There's a little bit that's come out on women's golf, which is really cool because that's, golf has been such an exclusive sport on many levels for so long, excluding women, excluding so many people just from an access point of view, and being so exclusive and sort of bound up in this, really, elitist sort of privileged position. And, golf is really, like, a lot of golf governing bodies are trying to change that perception and bring a lot more women in, and the women's golf fan culture is actually really cool. So that's a really interesting emerging research space. And it's starting to get more and more. I'm really hoping things like this Women's World Cup is drawing a lot of attention to the potential of a global women's tournament, or just women's sport in general from a research point of view, because there's so much that we still don't understand. And it's not just about the history and the culture. It's about the audience, the purchasing power, broadcast, sort of looking at technology, the sports science perspective. So there's so much opportunity here. So hopefully this is a bit of a tipping point, and maybe it's a bit of a call to my fellow academics out there to pay a bit more attention to this space, because it's needed. And as academics, we need to serve our community and play our role there. So it's our responsibility to do this, but also it's a really fun research space. So get involved, other academics. And if you need any help, shout out, I'm around.
Yeah, I feel like it's not just about academics, but journalists as well, because I feel like fans or fandom is kind of visible actually when it's men's sports, or like in Germany, it's a lot men's football because that's the number one sport in Germany. But on the other hand, I feel like the fans of women's football are very invisible, at least in Germany, and sometimes they can kind of feel unheard or, well, not regarded as much and even looked down upon, because as we already talked about before, it's a different kind of culture, it's a different kind of support. It's not, at least for now, at most places, your typical ultra groups going to places. So I don't know. What do you think about that, and what makes a real fan, if there even is such a thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. Yeah. What makes a real fan? And this is something I guess I'm trying to dispel a little bit in my research, is that there's no such thing. And that's a really contentious point to put across sometimes, because I think particularly like in a sport management sense, where we're trying to talk about fan engagement and leveraging like fan communities and audience, you kind of look at, what's the type of fan, who are we marketing to, how do we need to communicate with them, and it becomes very singular. And then, like we mentioned before, there's work being done to try and bring women out of that group, to try to communicate with women fans in a different way. But some of the work of the past has really put women in this homogenous group and not understanding the intersectionalities of different women and different lived experiences and where those intersections exist. So I think by acknowledging that there's no such thing as a real fan, we start to break down those barriers, and we can be a bit more creative with how we market sport, how we drive audience, how we do broadcasting, and how we do storytelling. And I think something you touched on there was like that sort of fans being invisible. Like the research that I'm doing, talking to different fans, I've said this to a few people, and it's almost like in women's sports, like this concept of just being a fan almost doesn't exist. I would say, and this is a really sweeping statement, so I'm sure there'll be people that disagree, which is totally fine, but I would say the biggest difference that I see in women's and men's sports is that a lot of men and fans of men's sport can just be a fan. They just go to a game, they might watch some games on TV, and they dip in and out of it. If the team disappoints them, they kind of get angry and turn it off and wait for the next game. And if they win, they're happy for a little bit, and that's kind of their connection. And I'm not trying to diminish that, because your fan connection can be really important to you. It's about your sense of identity. It's where you get your source of joy and sense of connection to. So I'm not trying to take that away. But what I would say for fans of women's sport is that kind of level of fandom very rarely exists, because most fans are doing something more. They're either creating their own content, they're on social media promoting the games, they are advocates, they are talking about their team all the time, they're activists as well, they have some kind of allegiance to different athletes, the sport itself, the women in sport movement. So they're putting themselves out there as, allies in that space to their favorite athletes and the political causes that they're supporting. Fans of women's sport are doing a lot more work to be fans, to justify that their fandom is valued, but they also see a bit of the bigger picture. So I think that's kind of the biggest difference between the two. And I wonder sometimes, going back to that conversation of what does success in women's sport look like? Well, is success for women's sport that fans of women's sport don't have to do that kind of work, that they can just rock up to a game and just enjoy it? Or is it the opposite, that success is that everyone is kind of connected in that way because we get more diverse storytelling, we get a different lens on the different kinds of fans that they are because everyone's doing it in different ways? So I don't know the answer to that question yet, but I think that's a really interesting point of difference. Something else I was thinking about with regards to the finals being moved to Sydney. Maybe I have to explain it a little bit because not everybody might know, but usually you would have the A-League's finals being played at, well, whichever team
reaches the final. But I think like half a year ago about that, there was a decision being made that every final for the next couple of years will be played in Sydney. And there was a huge debate on it. I mean, it was so big that it even reached me. And it kind of disrupted fan culture. And what I found very interesting is that I saw some discussions about how to protest this as fans, and that there were discussions about fans of men's clubs taking different kinds of actions than maybe the fans of the women's clubs, because of visibility, for example. And I don't know, can you say something about this maybe?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I'm not too aware of the different levels of protest between the supporters of the women's teams compared to the men's. But I guess like this is a very different kind of sporting landscape that we're used to here in Australia, bar the Australian rules grand final, which is always played in Melbourne. So there's an agreement with the MCG that the AFL grand final, regardless of the teams, is always in Melbourne, and that's kind of steeped in history. It's always been that way. So other codes now, and it's not just the A-League, Netball Australia is also looking at these kind of arrangements as well. This selling off of finals fixtures in sports is happening a bit here, because I think Australia at the moment is looking, like I was saying before, we look at global examples of what's happening around the world and where opportunity is to commercialize and drive revenue, and that's kind of the lens a few sporting codes here are taking. And it's because it's not seen as what we do here, there is a lot of resistance. So in terms of protest, you could see that a mile away, that people were going to be very upset because it doesn't ring true. And like we were discussing before, authenticity in sports is something that we take really seriously. So whether it's challenging someone's fan connection, if they're an authentic fan or not, whatever you decide authentic is, when we see our governing bodies and heads of different teams and sports trying to change what we perceive as authentic, we do get very upset. So the protests were interesting. And from like my memory of the protests in Melbourne, it was really upsetting because you could see the cause and wanting to protect that history and protect what had been happening in sort of football in Australia for a long time. That I sort of felt was justified, but then the protests did turn quite violent. And then that puts you in a really difficult position as a fan because you don't want to justify the behaviour, and you can feel disappointed in other fans, and you feel like, well, that takes away now from my argument and what I thought we were doing. So the conversations leading up to that particular match where there was where the supporters sort of took to the field and were throwing things and some players got injured, unfortunately, there were discussions about doing a peaceful protest and facilitating a walkout of the stadium in peaceful protest. And I was completely behind that, because I'm like, yeah, that's really powerful. And you want to have a voice as fans. Like as fans, we're connected to the thing that we support, and particularly in Australia, we have structures of sporting clubs where fans are members, and that means that they have like voting rights, and they're part of the club, and the clubs exist because of the fans. Like we should be considered as fans. So those moments are really difficult because and this challenges so many ways of so many parts of your identity as a fan, that even things I was talking about earlier from a gender perspective, it makes you question what you value as a fan. It makes you question your fan identity because you become so split. You don't want to be an apologist for your sport or your team or your club, but you kind of are because you love them. And then you don't want to be associated with other fans that are sort of bringing you down and making you look bad. So you have to justify then to people who are outside of the sport why you love this, and you don't want to apologize for their behavior either, but you're trying to get across the reasons why it got to that point, and it gets really complicated. So I don't know if I've really answered your question there, but I think we'll see more and more of that in an Australian sporting landscape, unfortunately, because the commercial climate's so different. And I think we'll see a lot more sporting codes try to be more commercially savvy and innovative with what they do with their fixturing and their broadcast from a commercial point of view. And it's going to be really interesting to see how fans react to that, because we might have some more ugly experiences. And I really hope that's something that doesn't ever replicate in the women's game. And I also hope it's something that fans who have sort of come through women's sport or being around more socially responsible sports and fan cultures can help educate other fans to do things in a way that is less violent and can still get their points across, but it doesn't get to that level again, because it really, those behaviours don't get us anywhere. And if anything, they set us back and make the governing bodies not want to listen to us more, because they just keep classing us as unreasonable and fanatic and crazy fans. Why would you listen to your fans if they behave like this? So I think there are ways that we can definitely galvanize ourselves to drive change in a better way. So that's my hope. But I also know the history of fans, and sometimes it doesn't always work.
Yeah, I think what I found very interesting about this, I definitely know the conflicted feelings I'm a Schalke supporter, and they had Gazprom on their shirt for a very long time, which is a Russian gas company. And then, of course, when the war started with Ukraine, they tried their utmost to really quickly get rid of what they apologized for years, and just carried on because they needed the money, because they are broke. But yeah, what I found interesting about the discussions about the protests or the different ways of protest is that, of course, you also get protests in the stadium that are full, that are crowded, where you have banners or special chants against something or for something. But you do have the measure as a group of fans to say, we are doing a walkout, as you just said. We won't be there. The stadium will be empty, or our stand at least will be empty. But then I think in women's football, it can be a bit different, because while spectator numbers in the stadiums are rising, it's still, you saw it in Essen. There's just this one stand being open, but on the TV, regardless of how many people are there, you always see the other ones who are empty, because that's the side the TV cameras are on. Yeah. So I was thinking about it, if Essen fans, for whatever reason, wanted to stage a protest, I don't think they would do it by not showing up, but I think they would try to be visible, be visible on the stand that they have, but maybe also hanging banners on the other side, so that it's actually on the TV broadcast, or do something really loud so that they can be heard. And so I don't know. I just thought about that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. There's so many things, I think, to protest in women's sport at the moment. As much as the momentum is really positive and there's some good things happening, like there's still so much to change. So I think like the most powerful thing that I've seen in women's sport was like the 2019 Women's World Cup, when it was that chant like equal pay, and that was a really visible sort of sign of protest. But again, like you're saying, like that was a pretty full stadium at a Women's World Cup. So at these local levels and leagues around the world, it would be very challenging. And I think that's why I see most fans sort of take to social media to try to protest there, because I think it's a real difficult position to be in as a fan of women's sport, in that you're kind of split between being that advocate, showing up to put those numbers in the stands, to buy the tickets, to make sure the TV's turned on so those broadcast numbers are being counted, to demonstrate that this thing that you love has value. You also know what the athletes are going through, how much they're being paid, the other jobs that they're working just to be able to survive. So it's almost like showing up is an act of protest anyway. Yeah. But that kind of changes the narrative as well. So I think that's what I was saying before, that fans of women's sport, I think, are doing a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it's really difficult. But I also think from my experience and the fans that I talk to, that what you get back from it is far more rewarding in sense of how you feel and being able to be your full self and have that sense of identity in the stands sort of helps make that a reciprocal relationship. So I kind of use the example sometimes that I feel like when you're a fan of a men's sporting code, it's like though your fandom is kind of like your athletes like owe you something. So, you know, you buy your season ticket, you buy some merchandise, you go, like, you are expecting something from them. And if they don't give it to you, then you're upset, you're disappointed, you want change. You might still love them fundamentally, of course. You might not want to leave them, but you expect something of them. I think the fan sensibility of women's sport is almost the opposite. Like, you kind of still expect, like, you know, your athletes to perform, but it's almost like you feel a sense of duty to the athletes. You're here to help support them because you understand their narrative a bit more. So I think that relationship makes the concept of protest also very different as well, and a lot more complicated.
Yeah, for sure. So we already talked about it a little, and we definitely talked about it when we met in Germany, about marketing and merchandise and, well, how important it is to fans to express themselves, to be able to buy certain kits or scarves or something. And it's also been quite a big debate around this World Cup because, I mean, with the Germany kits, we have Adidas, who are only selling the curved cut, and a lot of people, not just men, a lot of other people as well, definitely would like to have a straight cut. We don't have goalkeeper kits. But then, on the other hand, there's the Matildas, where Nike said, well, we have sold, before the World Cup even started, we have sold so many shirts, definitely more than we sold of the Socceroos during the Qatar World Cup and the time after. So I don't know, where do we stand on this, and what do these different polls mean?
I mean, like, I've heard this expression a lot, and like, it's cheesy, but it's the field of dreams thing, right? Like, if you build it, they will come. Yeah. And I think talking about like the sort of lack of academic research, and not just academic research, but also market research that's available. Like, if you did proper surveys of your audience and understood the demand of the audience, you would know what to make for them. And I think the pushback that I get sometimes when I talk to people at sporting organizations about merchandise is they see it as a risk to produce or overproduce and not be able to sell. And I think that's such an interesting position to be at, particularly at this point in time when we have such a focus on sustainability and climate and fast fashion. There are ways around that. Like, why aren't you doing pre-orders? Why don't you print on demand? Like, we have a very climate conscious audience right now that understands that sometimes you need to pay a little bit of a premium to get a piece of merchandise that is ethically sourced or is from recycled materials, and they're prepared to wait for it. So sometimes you don't need to have the merchandise right away, ready to go within 24 hours. If you were strategically thinking about your investment in women's sports and capitalizing from a commercial point of view, you would be doing that kind of research now to understand the type of cuts that your audience want. And Nike's seeing the benefits of this right now. Like, they've made their most size inclusive range of a jersey, and it is outselling the men's. Like, there is an audience there for it if you make things available, if you do it in a way that protects your business through something like a pre-order or having certain windows of time where you can order things. And this is something that we see again in the fan space of people who are creating their own merchandise to fill these gaps. You know, these are creators on their own, creating their own little businesses and these print runs of t-shirts or caps or scarves. They're doing it within these small windows of time, selling on social media, selling out, and then doing all of the shipping themselves. But they find a way to make it sustainable and make it work for them and make it profitable. And a lot of these creators are also then putting their profits back into their clubs who aren't doing this work or supporting athletes or doing it for crowdfunding. And it's just like, why are fans doing this work? Again, fans are doing so much work. But there are opportunities there. So I just find that quite staggering when that's kind of the pushback is, it's a risk factor. We don't know how much it's going to sell. It's also a lack of understanding for the type of merchandise that fans want. Like you said, the type of cut is definitely an important one for a jersey. And then it's also understanding, I was talking to someone at a team and they said, our jerseys don't sell. Like we have, we've invested in women's merchandise, but they don't sell. And I said, what do you have available? And they said, we've got the jersey. The jersey's like $120. But they have nothing else. They don't have a T-shirt, and then they also had the training shorts. So not the match day shorts, but training shorts. And I was like, what kind of fan is going to buy training shorts to wear to a stadium to watch a game? You might have some who might wear them to the gym or something, or while they're playing for their local team, but that's not fan merchandise. Kids can't wear that. It's freezing when the football's on. No one is wearing shorts. Of course they're not selling, but you didn't do any kind of survey or ask your fans, what do they want? Do they want just a hoodie that says like, go Matildas, for an example? That's those things are definitely available for the Matildas, but for like other teams, do you want just like a T-shirt that's not a full jersey but just has the team name on it, that you can wear it with a pair of jeans down to the pub to watch the game on TV for away games, or that is acceptable to wear like to the movies with friends? These kind of things we're starting to see more and more, and admittedly I know from the Matildas perspective and Football Australia, these items have come out a lot this World Cup and they are selling, which is really positive to see. So hopefully that signals to other sporting leagues and other teams that there is a market for this. But if you just make one item and don't make it size inclusive and you put a markup on it that's really expensive and it doesn't sell, that's should not tell you that there's no market for women's sports merchandise. It's like you're not creating what your fans want, and your fans want stuff because they're going to make it themselves, and that's what we see as well. So I know I've definitely purchased a lot of Matilda's gear this Women's World Cup. Spent a lot of my hard-earned money on it, which I'm happy to do, but I've also been buying a lot of things that fans are making, because they're still making things that I think the other side of it is, which taps into that the difference of the fan cultures around women's sport, is that there are things that I love to see on merchandise that are kind of could be seen as being in conflict with your fan identity if it was men's sport, like having, two team logos on something, or a player that has left and is playing for another club, but I still love that player. And that's so much more embraced in the women's sporting community. So I find a lot of independent creators online who are making really niche fan stuff that pays service to that I don't think a team or a league might do. So I think there's definitely place for both. But hopefully the lesson from this World Cup is, if you make it and you understand what your fans want, you can find a way to do it that's sustainable and it's profitable. You're going to make money if you serve your fans. So hopefully that will change, because, it's been really tough the last few years to find good fan merchandise.
Sometimes it's also just about embracing the meme. I'm just remembering all the Jill Scott expletive shirts and tote bags I saw after the Euros last year.
I love that stuff.
So now, obviously, we're at a World Cup, and I mean, I've seen a lot of different kinds of fan groups already, but to your experience, how is fandom experienced at this World Cup? How is it growing through the bigger media coverage football, and especially the Matildas in Australia, of course, have gotten here?
It's really interesting to sort of see, as someone who hasn't traditionally been a football fan. Like, I went to the World Cup in France in 2019 to a couple of matches, and I think it's kind of been widely reported from a lot of fans who were there. It's just, if you were in some of the bigger cities, you would just not know that the World Cup was on. And I was alone. And admittedly, I didn't have the opportunity to go to any of Australia's games while I was there. So I couldn't find any of my sort of fellow Australian fans. But the matches I went to there, I just went alone. I didn't really see a lot of big fan groups or a lot of things happening around the stadium. So I just kind of just went and enjoyed the football and left. And I didn't sort of come away thinking, oh, you know, here's the big fan culture, or here's some supporter groups, or I got to be part of these cool experiences. Whereas every match I've been to in Australia, I've been to Australian matches where I've met up with like supporter groups like the Matildas Active supporter group, who do an amazing job of connecting fans all across the country, promoting different bars to go to before the games, trying to give codes to everyone when tickets go on sale so you can sort of sit in those areas, which is just so much fun. And they do it in a really inclusive way where you can just go hang out with them, and they're going to teach you all the songs. They give you like, you know, sheets and QR codes to links that have all the words to their chants so you can sing along. You don't have to come with that prior knowledge. They just welcome you in, which is so wonderful. And then the matches I've gone to, which haven't been the Australian matches, like I went to Germany, Morocco, and like I was with yourself and we went to a bar that had the like German supporter group there, and that was really cool just to see. And I was like, okay, like everyone's here for this World Cup. I've seen other fan groups just hanging out in the front of stadiums doing their songs and their dances and just bringing other people in. I know the Lionesses fan group does this really well, where it's sort of, you think England football, and that could be really intimidating to a lot of fans who are not England football fans, but they are doing a great job at just like, yeah, we're going to this bar, we're going to be at this place before the game or after the game. Everyone's welcome. It doesn't matter what country you're from or who you're supporting. Like, yes, there might be a bit of ribbing and hoping that
bit of banter.
A bit of banter. We love the banter, but it's done in such a much more inclusive way, I would say, than what I've ever experienced at men's football. So in saying that, like, I've never been to a men's football World Cup, so I don't have that experience to compare it to. But at the same time, I'm not motivated to go to a men's World Cup because from what I see on the outside, it's not something I really feel like I want to connect with. Maybe if I'd grown up with football for a longer time, like as I said, I'm a pretty new fan. It's only been like the last 5 years I've started to follow women's football. So if I had a longer fan connection, maybe I would feel differently. But right now, my entry point to football is women's football, and I want to be around that environment all the time. So I'm not motivated to try to go to a men's World Cup or mostly go, or even like A-League men's matches here in Australia. I don't feel as confident going into a stadium by myself. That doesn't sound like something I really want to put myself through, and maybe I'm prejudging that space, which, you know, I'm happy to be told otherwise, but I just don't feel it's for me. Whereas most women's World Cup games that I've gone to in Australia, I just buy a single ticket. And it's almost like it doesn't matter because I go find people before the game. I see friends and familiar faces or people from social media that I get to meet in person outside the stadium, and you sort of put faces to names. I sit down, I talk to people around me, and I've had a great experience at every match, no matter if it's an Australian game or a neutral game with other countries participating. So for me, that's been my experience of the fan culture, and that has just made this Women's World Cup just such a wonderful experience and like something I'm just absolutely will treasure forever.
Yeah, I'm a bit sad because, I mean, obviously I'm very privileged in being here as a journalist and sitting on the press tribune all of the time, but so many times I arrive at a stadium before everybody else is there, or just like the first people arrive, and then I'm sitting there, can't connect to the fans, and then I have to stay very long after the final whistle, and again can't really connect to the fans, and everybody else has, I don't know, wandered off. And I think, yeah, the most fun experience I had was actually here in Melbourne when I went to the Nigeria-Canada match, because the small little tram, it was just packed with Nigeria and Canada fans, and they were singing songs to each other to be louder than the others, but in a very humorous, joking, fun kind of way. And it was just so cool.
That's so awesome. Yeah, it's a tough one being a journalist. I get that question all the time because like I do a bit of freelance journalism, but very minimal, like compared to someone like yourself who is doing so much work. And people ask me, are you going to try and get like accreditation for the FIFA World Cup? And I was like, I don't think so. I mean, my primary job is to do the research as an academic, and I do a little bit of storytelling, but what I end up doing is I find ways just to tell stories about fans, because I love fan culture so much. Obviously, after this conversation, you probably know that. So I'll write a few pieces. Like I did a piece about the Matildas active support group and spoke about the fan culture.
Which is very good, and we will link to.
Oh, thank you so much. But for me, because I don't see that storytelling so much by other journalists, and their skill is to do the analysis, and cover the game and do the player profiles, and I can't do that. That's not my skill set. But I know about fans, and I love telling stories, so I do that kind of journalism. And then what that allows me to do is then to be in those fan zones, so that I still get my fan experience. So when I get asked that question about, don't you want to like apply and be a journalist? I'm like, I'll let the professional journalists do that. I'll just stay in my little fan zone.
Yeah, then maybe getting a little bit towards the end here, you also look at depictions of fans and fandom and pop culture through your work. And when I read that, I was thinking like, I mean, there's only like 2 or 3 different ways fans are mostly depicted. I mean, even on a show like Ted Lasso, where you have these women working in football, different depictions of them. And then there is this woman working the bar where all the fans hang out. And she obviously is a very strong person and an expert on her club. But all the other fans, if I'm not misremembering right now, they are men, and they are depicted in a very, common way, like very stereotypical. So I was wondering, I don't know, are there any other examples that I've missed?
It's such a good question. And I mean, I could talk for hours about depictions of fans in pop culture. It's my absolute favorite little niche. But yeah, you're right. Like, I think we are starting to get more and more diversity in our sports storytelling, like not as much as I would like to see, but we are getting, because of this trend of streaming services and investment in independent and alternative media, there are these programs coming through that try to shine a light on more diverse sports, and Ted Lasso is a really interesting example of that. But even in doing that, you're right, fans are still quite left out of those depictions. We're trying to show more diversity in the athletes and the governance and leadership of clubs and coaching styles and what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be non-binary in sporting spaces, which is really importing narratives. But as part of that storytelling, fans are often really left out of that, which I find so fascinating when fans are so fundamental to the sporting experience. And if we didn't have fans, sports would just not exist in this way. And fans are the ones who are consuming all of this content that we're putting out there, but fans so rarely get to see themselves reflected back in these stories. So what I try to do is I look at sort of content that's come out and try to unpack how women are being represented, and then hopefully future work, I'm going to do some more work in creative spaces to hopefully produce more stories that reflect diverse experiences of fandom.
Well, and shortly before we wanted to wrap things up properly, we got cut short. So right now you're hearing me in post, but I think this has been a very exciting and dense conversation, touching on a lot of different things. If you'd like to dig deeper, we will have links to Kasey's work and her socials in our show notes. On Twitter, you can find her via @Kasey Symons, and on Instagram via Kasey_writes. I'd once again like to thank Kasey for all of her insights and for taking the time to talk to me so that all of you folks can hear about her work as well. If you're an English speaker tuning into this, I have to say that all other episodes of Rasenfunk are in German. Rasenfunk is an independent podcast that is financed by community donations, which also made it possible for me to be here at this World Cup and cover the tournament from on site, which is very amazing. So thank you all for that, and thanks to all of you for listening as well. My name's Annika Becke, and this has been Rasenfunk from Australia with Dr. Kasey Symons. Bye!
Das war der Rasenfunk. Wir geben nun zurück in die angeschlossenen Funkhäuser. Psst. Rasenfunk unterstützen, ihr Knauser.